I happen on a video titled "Sam Harris Destroys the Bible and the Quran in 5 Minutes." Now, although that sounded like a stretch, I did take the bait. I had to see this.
A bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now, that's a pretty major claim. And to be fair, it's not the claim that Harris himself is making. It's the claim of the channel who edited and posted the video. In this case, that's Pangorn. But the question is, did he? And my answer is possibly. Let's look at it. Now, the setting was a debate between Harris and Jordan Peterson, and this is one clip out of a very long conversation. His fundamental argument is essentially these books, the Quran and the Bible, don't represent the highest humanity is capable of ethically or in other categories either. They hold people to antiquated ethical guidelines, which can't be edited, and some of those guidelines are terrible. For instance, the Quran's charge to chop off the hands of thieves. Now, first I want to say this. I know he's talking about both the Quran and the Bible, but for my purposes and because I am a Bible believer, I'm going to separate the Bible and the Quran into different categories. Now, granted, he lumps them both together because they both claim to be given by God, and therefore they hold a kind of absolute authority that he's critiquing. But when you drill down to the structure, the goals, the corresponding philosophies, and even the history of each of the books, they deserve to be treated differently from one another because they are very different from one another. And this is evident simply on a literary level. You don't have to believe that either is inspired to notice this. All you have to do is be able to read. See, the Quran, for instance, was published over 600 years after the events recorded in the Bible and views itself as a correction or an addition to the Bible. But its format from beginning to end is one man, Muhammad, claiming to receive messages from God through an angel and the content of those messages. And it talks in that same voice throughout the entire thing. Now, the Bible, on the other hand, is vastly different. It was simply on a literary level. It's one book that's really a library of books, which includes a number of different genres. There's personalities, historical events, and they cover vast swaths of time. Not to mention, it's a very different take on ethics and the portrayal of God and the highest ideal of the good. Now, the simplest illustration of this is the lives and teachings of the heroes of each book. Jesus versus Muhammad. They're very, very different in personality, aims, lifestyles, values, methodologies, and ends that they were trying to achieve. I would actually join with Harris in his criticism of the Quran, but the Bible is a different matter because it's a very different book with a very different history and legacy. But where he joins the two in the same criticism is their respective outlook on slavery, and I'll give him that for now. Here's how he says it.
Slavery is condoned in the Bible, in both Testaments, and in the Quran. There's no getting away from that. Now, you can say, well, it's not the central thrust of any of these books, but if you go to the books and try to figure out what the creator of the universe wants with respect to the owning and needless immiseration of other people, right? He expects you to keep slaves, and he's told you how to do it.
Now, he follows this by making an example of ISIS, a Muslim terrorist group who were known to have raped women in territories they invaded, and they viewed it as a religious rite and even a sacrament, in his words. It was their religion, not just their human nature, that pushed them to these kinds of extremes. He continues this way.
I would argue, in many cases, psychologically normal people who are simply convinced of the absolute veracity of these ideas. And in this case, the perfect example of Muhammad as the most self-actualized human who's ever existed. And, what did Muhammad do? Muhammad took sex slaves.
Okay, well, point well taken when talking about Islam. Maybe he does destroy the Quran in 5 minutes. I'll leave that to Muslims to determine that. But his basic idea is religion takes psychologically normal people and pushes them into crazy and ethically horrific actions because of its unquestioned claims of authority. Okay, but the way he finishes up his thought is where the things get a lot more interesting. Now, we'll pick it up as he comes out of his point about slavery and he goes on to chastise Jordan Peterson for his view of religion.
And this is where there's a tension between how we pursue the same goals. Like as we've just established, we have many of the same goals. But insofar as you make religion look palatable, insofar as you suggest to your audience that they can have their religious cake and eat it too, they can have their reason, they can have their respect for science, they can have a 21st century worldview, but they can also hold on to everything they love in Christianity or fear to lose. And it's undoubtedly mostly Christianity, but whatever, any religion. My concern is that it keeps us shackled to these Iron Age philosophies and these Iron Age conversations where we should be having a 21st century conversation about everything, ethics included.
Now, for me, this is where things get to the heart of the issue and where his supposed destruction of the Bible is, let's just say, questionable. Now, I'll say this, even though I'm willing to grant one of his points. Now, while I disagree that the Bible, especially the New Testament, outright condones slavery, I will admit that its relationship to slavery is at best ambivalent. Now, I say this because on one hand, the pivotal event in all of salvation history in the Old Testament is the Exodus, which is the story of the deliverance of the Hebrews from slavery. Now, on the other hand, we don't have outright commands from God saying do not engage in slavery in the same way we have very clear directives against idolatry or adultery. Now, the Bible, as it reports out the reality of slavery in the world in which it was written, notably the New Testament, doesn't outright condone it. It seems to cooperate with it and not battle it in the way that we would expect. Now, intellectual integrity demands that Christians grant that fact. However, intellectual integrity also demands of Sam Harris that he acknowledge a very important historical and ethical fact, and I don't know if he does or doesn't in other contexts, and it's this. Slavery ended in large part because of the very specific biblical convictions of social reformers in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Bible is known to have taken what he would call psychologically normal people, and it turns them into social justice heroes. In other words, I have to admit to having struggles with the Bible's handling of slavery, but honesty should demand of Sam Harris that he struggle with the very real and historically verified reality that slavery ended due to the actions of people who were motivated by the Bible. Now, the issue of slavery is fascinating because it's something we all in the West have learned to loathe as ethically reprehensible. However, it's something that's also been around since like nearly the dawn of human civilization, and it was practiced by, sad to say, Christians, but also countless other people groups all over the world who had wide varieties of religious outlooks and practices, from the Romans to the Comanche tribe in North America. Now, slavery was a normal practice because conquest, subjugation, and conquered peoples was normal practice for centuries, millennia, all over the world, and it still goes on, by the way. Now, this included the British Empire, which conquered so much of the world, but while acknowledging that, we all should acknowledge that the end of slavery as we know it and our subsequent disdain that we have for it came from Great Britain and the leaders of the abolitionist movement there. The most noteworthy leader among these was William Wilberforce. And it's an undeniable fact that Wilberforce saw himself as called by God to battle the slave trade, which he did, sacrificially, tirelessly, and bravely all of his adult life. See, Wilberforce in his early life enjoyed the wealth and privilege of the elite class in Britain. So he's elected to Parliament at 21 years old and describes himself by saying he did, quote, nothing to any purpose. My own distinction was my darling object. Until, and this is hugely relevant to the subject that we're talking about, he reads a book called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul by Philip Doddridge, which is inspired by the Bible. It convinces him that God has called him and his life needs to change. Now, then he even considered dropping out of Parliament until he talks to the former slaver, now Christian, John Newton, who tells Wilberforce that he should use his parliamentary role for, quote, the glory of God, which is a biblical idea. So Wilberforce seeks God and writes this down about his life. Quote, God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners, which is kind of an interesting thing. Well, out of that, he joins and becomes a key leader in a group called the Clapham sect, who, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, this group was, quote, responsible in large part for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in England. And they were an absolutely biblical Christian group started by a pastor. And this raises a couple of very important points about whether or not Sam Harris destroyed the Bible in 5 minutes. See, he uses slavery as an example of the Bible's shortcomings. Okay. But at the same time, he's offering his critique while intellectually standing in a world created by biblically driven abolitionists like William Wilberforce. Wilberforce laid down his life of ease to take on something that was worldwide, and if you asked him why, he would say he was doing it out of a sense of calling from the God of the Bible, the very God that Sam Harris insists isn't there. Someone might come back and say, but the Bible was used to justify slavery too. True, but civilizations around the world, which had no knowledge of the Bible at all, practiced slavery. And the empire that battled against it and gave Sam Harris and the rest of us virtually a slave-free world defined itself as Christian, and Christian leaders like Wilberforce led the charge. And the question is, would that have happened had Wilberforce and others like him not had the Bible challenging their lack of purpose. Now, secondly, in pushing back on Peterson, Harris says these books have kept us shackled to the Iron Age and we need to have a 21st century conversation. Well, that's interesting because that Iron Age book, called the Bible, spoke into 18th and 19th century people and revolutionized them to the point of ridding the world of the all-pervasive, nearly universal evil of slavery. Now, the question is, could or would that have happened if the Bible was not there? Now, it's hard to imagine how, since it's been practiced with or without the Bible. And another question is, and if we didn't have the Bible at all, what kind of worldview would we develop on our own that would call people to the necessary level of self-sacrifice, perseverance, and these high ideals about humanity required to win the battle like Wilberforce and Great Britain did? It's hard to imagine what that would look like, especially since Western culture is in the process, as we speak, of developing a worldview that is free of biblical ultimates and borders led by people like Harris. Now, we're watching it in real time, and the most popular 21st century outlook and conversation is becoming what appears to be like this blend of radical subgroup identity and categories, which are based increasingly on the subjective experience of individuals. And we're seeing that 21st century mindset descend into absurdity. Just look at this article from Toronto Sun, where a 50-year-old man subjectively identified himself as a 13-year-old girl and was allowed to compete with them in swimming and then undress with them in the locker room. Now, why is that relevant? Because according to Harris, we need to get rid of the Iron Age outlook and go full 21st century and have those conversations. Well, something tells me with all their shortcomings, Iron Age people or 18th and 19th century people like Wilberforce would look at incidents like that and be rightly confident that we in the 21st century have lost touch with reality. In short, there's a lot more to the Bible than Harris is giving credit to. He didn't destroy it, and it's a good thing because we need it. Well, I hope that helps. Please remember to hit like and subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments.